Hello, Chapter 9, Management of Economic Exposure. So this chapter provides a way to measure economic exposure, discuss its determinant, and present a method for managing and hedging economic exposure. So what is economic exposure? So economic exposure is the change in exchange rate can affect not only firms that are directly engaged in international trade, but also purely domestic firms. Which means that now exchange rate is not just for the international firms matter, it's actually also the domestic firms matter too. If these domestic firms' product compete with imported goods, then they actually are exposed to exchange rate risk too, because their competitive position is affected by the strength of local currencies or weaknesses too. So if you run a bicycle company in the United States and only source, produce, and sells on the United States, so it's a purely domestic firm, you don't have any imported goods to use. Since the firm's products compete against imported bicycle, now it's subject to foreign exchange exposure actually. Their customers basically are, usually customers don't care whether this is from US or from Italy or from China. They actually compare costs and features, basically. Domestic bicycle and Japanese, British, Italian bicycles too. So exchange rate risk is applied to this firm's competitive position, right? Any anticipated changes, so expected changes, probably fine, because it's expected. So expected changes is already reflected from value, so it does not change from value, but economic exposure is basically come from the unanticipated change in exchange rate, and value of the firm will be changed by unanticipated change in exchange rate. So the exhibit 9 point show that this is the market beta and the forex beta for each industry. Now this is, so market sensitivity is that they calculate the beta as the sensitivity to the change in market, versus the forex beta is the sensitivity to the change in the foreign exchange. And really depending on the industry, some forex beta is really high, some forex beta is low or close to zero, some forex beta is negative, some forex beta is positive, right? And out of 25 industrial studies here, 10 were found that they have significant exposure to exchange rate movements. So actually, it doesn't matter whether this company run a business in the US or in foreign country, everybody is now affected by the exchange rate in economic term. So how to measure this economic exposure? It's basically sensitivity, right? Sensitivity of the future home currency value of the firm's asset and liability and firm's operating cash flow, the random changes in exchange rate. So there are two parts. One part is the assets and liability part. So firm's asset liability value changes based on the exchange rate. That's one part. And the other part is the operating cash flow. So firm's operating cash flows are also affected by the random change in exchange rate. So we have to actually separate these two cases and manage separately in each. So next exhibit show that, well, the exchange rate fluctuation changes how currency value of asset and liability, home currency value of asset and liability, and affected to the firm value. This is asset exposure or liability exposure, basically. And also it affected the future operating cash flow, which is obviously affected to the firm value, right? And this is called the operating exposure. So let's measure it. Let's measure it. The measurement is pretty statistical, actually. So I'm going to show some technical stuff on how to measure this economic exposure. So if the United States multinational company corporation were to run a regression on a dollar value, so P is the dollar value, okay, of its British assets. So asset is in Britain. So the MNC, they have assets in foreign country too, right? On the dollar pound exchange rate, okay? That's called S. So the value of dollars in terms of dollar equals to, this is exchange rate, so this beta is the sensitivity, and this alpha is the regression constant. So if you run a regression, you have some intercept, right? That's alpha. And the epsilon E is the random error term with mean 0. So basically, they run a univariate OLS regression to see the relation between the dollar value, firm value, versus the exchange rate. So how exchange rate affect to the value of the firm, and if you find the sensitivity, then that's the Forex beta, actually. So statistically, you can find this beta equals to covariance of the firm value in dollars and exchange rate and the variance of the spot rate, exchange rate. So the exposure of the coefficients show that there are two sources of economic exposure, right? One is this variance part, so variance of exchange rate. The other part is the relation, the covariance between the dollar value of the asset and the exchange rate. So these two factors affect the economic exposure. So if they're more related, then basically, so if exchange rate affect to the firm value in dollars more degree, like they're more related, then you are exposed to higher level of the economic exposure, right? So this is example. Suppose there's a US company has an asset in the UK whose local currency price is random, obviously. For simplicity, suppose there are only 3 states of the world and each state is equally likely to occur. So just this is scenario Gnosis, so-called. So we have only 3 scenarios and equal probability. So each probability will be 1/3. The future local currency price is actually not French, it's a UK asset, I'm sorry. This British asset, P star as well as the future exchange rate will be determined depending on the realized star states of the world, okay? So let's have the 3 cases. We have 3 cases. So case 1, when we compute the parameter value of the case 1, I mean, we basically, so the case is, this is the case. So when S is 140, 150, 160, these are 3 cases, right? So these are the determinant, and calculate the pounds firm value, basically 980, 1,000, 1,070. They are positively correlated, right? They are positively correlated, obviously. The next slide actually show how to calculate the mean, the average variance and covariance, and how to compute the beta, the exposure coefficient. So just in case you want to know, you can actually see this table. Again, go back to this. Again, we have S 140, 150, 160, and this is the values. So they are basically positively related. If they are positively related, the beta is 1,700 pounds, which means that the U.S. firm faces substantial exposure to currency risk, right? Because based on the change in exchange rate, fund value changes substantially. Case 2. Now, the local currency price of the asset and the exchange rate are negatively correlated because you see this S and this P, as S increases, P decreases, right? So they are opposite relations, like they move in opposite way, which means that their covariance should be negative. In fact, the effect of exchange rate changes is exactly offset by movement of the local currency price of the asset, rendering the dollar price of the asset totally insensitive to exchange rate changes. That's why when you calculate the beta is a 0 and covariance is a 0. So there are no relations. The future dollar price of the asset will be uniformly 1,400. So these cases, so this is dollar P, right? This is UK price. This is dollar price. So even though it decreases, the dollar value doesn't change. Case 1, exchange rate increases, P increases in the pounds term, and dollar increases in dollar terms through. Now, the B case, they are negatively related, and with the P, is all uniformly $1,400, no relations. So one can say that the British asset is effectively denominated in terms of dollars. It's very unrealistic case, but it showed that uncertain exchange rates or exchange rate risk does not necessarily constitute exchange exposure. Sometimes like it's very unrealistic. So we probably are not going to have this type of situation very from never actually, but you can have the close example. So basically, even though you are in the same, like in a foreign country or 2 countries, 3 countries, no exposure. Since the firm faces no exposure, no hedging will be necessary. So you don't have to hedge anything. Now K3, now you can look at the K3 as interest rate increase. Still, your pounds value doesn't change and dollar value only if it changes. And obviously, so your B will be 1,000 pounds. So case 3, local currency price of the asset is fixed at 1,000 pounds. In this case, the United States firms face a contractual cash flow that is denominated in pounds, right? In fact, it represents an example of the special case of economic exposure, transaction exposure. Intuition, what is the risk? Is 1,000 pounds, that is the exposure coefficient. B is also 1,000. You can confirm that this is true from the same calculation in the next slide. Measurement of this transaction exposure is thus very simple, just the 1,000 pounds. The exposure coefficient B is the same as the magnitude of the contractual cash flow fixed in terms of the foreign currency. So ABC, now A, the amount of the exposure is highest, and B, not known, and C is contractual. Obviously, we have a lot more cases you have to handle. So basically what you have to do is we statistically solve this problem. And in practice, you need to use a computer program to simulate this type of situation, and then you can get the right calculation. Now, once you identify this magnitude of exposure, so case A, the coefficient is 1,700 pounds. Case 3 is 1,000 pounds, right? Now the firm have to hedge this exposure. Simplest way is just by selling the exposure forward contract. So let's look at case 3 first. Case 3, where asset value is fixed in terms of local currency, it is possible that you can completely eliminate this variability of the future dollar price of the asset by selling just 1,000 pounds forward. It's a simple way to hedge. So let's look at B. You can just sell the 1,000 pounds forward. What you can do is now you have exchange rate 140, 150, 160. You basically have 1,400, 1,500, 1,600 in each state. There's a proceeds from the contract values, like the suppose 150 is future spot rate, okay? Then you don't have anything from here. You earn 100, you lose 100, so you have 1,500 all the time. So you can completely hedge. However, case one is a little bit different because local currency price of the asset is basically random. So even though you sell like this fourth contract, which is 1,700 forward contract, does not resolve everything. Okay. So what you can do is now, if you use this one like this, so same thing. You use these four contracts same way, and you can get the 1,500 in state two, but you will get more, actually $1,542 in 2 states. So there is some variance about this position, about 392. But comparing with just the unhedged one, which is 19,659, so you can compare these two, then you are exposed to a lot lower risk. So the variance of the dollar value itself without forward contracts, 19,659. Now after hedging the forward contract, it lowered to 392 because there's some proceeds from this forward contract, right? So the good thing is now what you can do is you should actually have to hedge because you can reduce the risk. You can reduce the exposure. So to reduce the exposure, you have to hedge, even though it does not completely solve the problems. Okay. Case C again is a 0, which means that you eliminate the exposure. Without, then you still have high variability. So the value of the firm will be fluctuated based on the exchange rate. That's why we need to hedge. So that's how you measure the economic exposure. So next part, we'll see operating exposures.